Hello, so the last part of plant transport then is all about hydrophytes and xerophytes. Now, there are basically three types of plants. There's xerophytes, mesophytes, and hydrophytes. Mesophytes are actually the ones that we know most about because anytime we've looked at the cross section of a leaf, it's been a mesophytic leaf. But now what we're on to looking at is xerophytes, which live in areas which are very, very dry, and hydrophytes, which live in areas which have a lot of water. So both xerophytes and hydrophytes have adaptations to allow them to live in those areas. So for example, a xerophyte, its biggest problem is getting and keeping water. So it's adapted to prevent water loss. As I say, xerophytes will live in areas of very, very low water levels, maybe even deserts. And hydrophytes will live in like ponds, in water, around water, or in waterlogged soil. So the biggest problem for hydrophytes then is getting oxygen for respiration. So it's adapted to get and keep gases and also make sure that it can get enough light to photosynthesize. So looking at this then, these are xerophytes. So these are adapted to prevent water loss from transpiration. And the main reason for this is because their spongy mesophyll is used for gas exchange and the evaporation of water from transpiration. So because the spongy mesophyll is used for both, what they basically need to try and do is get the gases into their spongy mesophyll, but try and prevent losing much water. Because remember, they live in really, really dry areas, so they want to try and hang on to water as much as they can because they can't get an easy supply. These are mesophytes, which we've typically looked at. So these are adapted to live in most conditions, and they want to be able to photosynthesize at a pretty high rate. So their adaptations are things like the palisade mesophyll, the spongy mesophyll, having stomata, having the waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. Hydrophytes then are best adapted to live in water, or beside water, or in waterlogged soils. So all of their adaptations that they're going to have are primarily based towards getting enough oxygen for respiration. So you can see here we've got these little water lilies up in this diagram. So an adaptation of them, for example, is going to be that they've got lots of aerated tissue, which means it can float to the surface of the water and it will be able to get light for photosynthesis. It's also going to have stomata on its upper surface because its lower surface is submerged in water. So if the stomata are at the top, it means that the gases can go in through the upper surface, which is exposed. So here's three typical plants then. We've got a cactus, a potato plant, and Elodea. So this is our xerophyte, this is our mesophyte, and this is our hydrophyte. Now, what we're going to do here is look at the adaptations of a xerophyte and adaptations of a hydrophyte. So this just shows a cross section of the hydrophyte and the xerophyte. So actually their adaptations are very, very different. Okay, these big large air spaces here, as I said earlier, were basically big air spaces contained within the leaf so that they contain oxygen which can be used for respiration, and they also help with buoyancy, which basically means the leaf can float to the upper surface of the water so that it can photosynthesize. Likewise, here is a stomata on the upper surface. And what you'll notice about this as well is that this here is just phloem. They don't really need a xylem because they're mostly submerged in water. So if they do have a xylem, it's way, way smaller or less prominent than it otherwise would be in a mesophyte. Whereas here, this is a xerophyte. Now, this is actually a piece of marram grass, which is that really, really sharp, spiky grass that you see on sand dunes. So there's loads of things we can see here. It's got a curved shape or a rolled leaf. It's got sunken stomata, which means that they're really deep within it. It's got little hairs. They generally have thick cuticles, which is found on the outer surface there. And then other things which aren't shown in this is deep roots, succulent tissue, and sometimes xerophytes will also have needles or spikes instead of leaves. So let's get into it then. So here's some marram grass. Now let's look at some of the adaptations then. So the first one is leaf curvature. So this was a cross section of marram grass. And in this case, this is the upper epidermis. And this layer on the inside is the lower epidermis. So the lower epidermis is enclosed because of the way the leaf is curved. This means that when water evaporates out of the stomata, it's trapped within the roll. So the stomata, as I said, were sunken down, but say these water molecules evaporate, you basically get a buildup of water molecules on the inside of the leaf. And because we've talked about transpiration and all, you could probably guess what this does. It builds up a layer of humid air and it decreases the water potential gradient from the inside of the leaf to the outside of the leaf. So there's quite a high water potential in there. Because all this water builds up in this area, it's also high. So there's basically a shallow water potential gradient, so less water gets lost that way. The next adaptation is hairs. So xerophytic leaves will often have these little hairs. Now they're found on the lower epidermis. It basically restricts air movement or wind over the leaf surface. So again, it traps a layer of humid air within these hairs. And that has the same effect. It decreases the water potential gradient from the inside of the leaf to the outside of the leaf. Sunken stomata then. So in this case, the stomata are found in little pits. Now, you can see here that this is where they are in this diagram. This is where they would be in this one. And BTW, how friendly do these little guys look? So the stomata are embedded deeper in the lower epidermis, which means that humid air once again builds up outside the stomata, and these are known as diffusion shells. And again, it decreases the water potential gradient from the inside to the outside of the leaf. So there we've got three adaptations which all basically have the same effect. Trapping lots of water or humid air within the inside of the leaf or near the stomata, and it decreases the water potential gradient from the inside of the leaf to the outside. So basically, there's a shallower diffusion gradient, so less water will be lost. As well as that, xerophytes can have reduced surface area of leaves or needles. So sometimes instead of having leaves, they'll just have needles. And there's two main reasons for this. It reduces the surface area from which water can be lost, because if they've got less leaves, they'll have less stomata. And it will also protect the tissues from grazing. If you think about it, if you've got a wee cactus here, and an animal comes along and takes a big chomp out of it there, it basically means that you get left with this area where the cuticle has been removed and water can evaporate out of there. So by having these little spikes, it basically means that no animals are going to want to bite it because it's going to hurt their mouths. So it protects the tissues from drying out. Now, I should say here as well that the stems are the main photosynthetic organs in xerophytes, not the leaves or the needles. They also have very, very thick cuticles, which further prevents water loss through the cuticle. So here we can see this little pink layer is the waxy cuticle. It's thicker than it would be in a mesophyte or a hydrophyte. And then this shows a cross section of a cactus, and that's in there. So just by having a thicker cuticle than normal, decreases the amount of evaporation through the cuticle. Then, xerophytes also have succulent tissue, which basically means they're quite juicy. So this here is a little aloe vera, which has been cut in half. Now you can actually see here it's got the thick cuticle, it's got the little spikes, but in here is its succulent tissue, which is really useful because it means that they can store additional water for extra dry periods or periods of drought. The final adaptation then that we're going to look at is that xerophytes can either have very deep roots, which can find water which is stored deep underground. So for example, this one has really deep roots which can go very deep underground and find any water that's stored. Or like this cactus, they normally have shallow, extensive roots, so they can spread out over really wide areas. But it basically means that if there's infrequent rainfall, because this cactus is covering such a large area, it should be able to absorb as much water as possible when the rainfall does come. So they can either have deep roots or shallow, extensive roots. My final thing we're going to say about xerophytes then is things like pine trees and other species of evergreen trees which are found in northern parts of the world also show xerophytic adaptations. Now that's because they live in really cold areas where most of the water that's going to be available is frozen for large parts of winter, so they can't actually absorb it. But as well as that, they don't want to dry out from losing too much water, so they will show xerophytic adaptations. The main adaptations they would have is needles as leaves and having sunken stomata. Now the final little part of plant transport then is hydrophytes. So we said that they lived wholly or partly submerged in water, and the greatest problem for hydrophytes is obtaining oxygen for respiration and maximum light for photosynthesis. Now, this is because waterlogged soil has no air spaces and the water between the soil particles contains very little oxygen. So one adaptation that they're going to have is having aeration tissue or aerenchyma. This typically comprises large air spaces called lacunae between the cells of the stem and leaves. They form an extensive communicating network throughout submerged parts of the plant. It means that oxygen produced by photosynthesis during the day has the opportunity to diffuse through the plant. It also provides buoyancy to the plant, lifting the leaves to the surface of the water where they can get the maximum light for photosynthesis. They have got little supporting tissue as the water acts as a medium. The xylem is absent as it is not required in the aqueous or water-based environment. If the hydrophyte is submerged, then stomata are absent or non-functional, while floating plants such as the water lilies have their stomata on the upper surfaces of the leaf. So here we've got a little cross section. Now, if we look at this, this is the upper epidermis. This is the lower epidermis. Now, here is this little vascular bundle made up mostly of phloem. And then this layer here is the aerenchyma. And this is the tissue layer, which contains these big, massive air spaces all around here, known as lacunae. This layer here is the palisade mesophyll, which is where most photosynthesis is going to take place. This here then is a little air space, which pretty much means that just above that, even though you couldn't see it in this photograph, is likely to be the stomata on the upper surface of the leaf. Now remember, if this is a little bit of water and this is a little leaf, its little lacunae are going to help it float so that it's going to be able to go to the upper surface of the water, so it can sit up there, and it basically means that it can get light for photosynthesis, and because it's got stomata on the top, it can get oxygen in for respiration.